Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today, we are looking at what happens when cold, hard computer algorithms are used to decode the most unquantifiable concepts in human history: belief in God, sacred values, and religious violence. We are exploring a fascinating project that takes ancient religious texts and turns them into computer simulations to predict human behavior, contrasting the secular worldview with deeply held religious devotion.
Yeah, it's an incredibly ambitious attempt to basically quantify the unquantifiable. You have this highly empirical, rigid realm of computer science trying to map out, the deepest mysteries of human faith.
Right. And to guide us through this, we're looking at a really extensive interview with Dr. Wood from the YouTube channel Religion for Breakfast, which was aided by Jen Lindsay. Our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how researchers are bridging the gap between ancient theology and modern computational modeling to solve real-world conflicts. And if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button, because this conversation is really going to challenge how you view human motivation.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the tension between the secular and the religious is exactly the friction powering this whole research project. For decades, those two worlds operated in completely separate silos, right?
Yeah, totally separate.
Right. And the secular worldview often categorized religious devotion as sort of a sociological anomaly, like it was too irrational to quantify. Meanwhile, humanists argued that science could just never capture the transcendent nature of belief.
Okay, let's unpack this, because my immediate question is about the methodology. It's like trying to build a video game physics engine, but instead of coding gravity or wind resistance, you are trying to code the philosophy of religion and human faith. I mean, how do you even begin to translate the divine into data?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the computer scientists actually acknowledge the limitation right out of the gate. The Modeling Religion project doesn't generate its own raw data at all.
Wait, really? None of it?
None. An algorithm cannot perform philology. A piece of software can't, sit down with a crumbling clay tablet from ancient Mesopotamia and decipher the cultural weight of an Akkadian prayer. They desperately need the humanities for that.
Oh, so they have to bring in experts in ancient languages, like scholars who study Akkadian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Egyptian.
Exactly. They also rely heavily on psychologists, anthropologists, and philosophers of religion. The process is basically taking that humanistic data, turning it into a model, running a simulation, and then comparing the output to real-world phenomena.
But how do you go from a translated ancient prayer to a mathematical variable? Like, if I'm a historian, I can tell you a Bronze Age culture sacrificed grain to their local deity. How does a programmer use that?
Right, so the anthropologist looks at that and says, this indicates a high level of costly signaling, like they're giving up vital survival resources to prove group loyalty. Then the computer scientist takes that concept and assigns it a numerical weight in the code.
I see. So it's not about programming the feeling of belief. It's about programming the measurable actions that belief demands.
Exactly. You distill it into behavioral rules for virtual agents. Then you let this virtual society interact over thousands of simulated years. And if the simulated society matches the real-world archaeological evidence, the algorithm captured the mechanics of that belief system.
That is a massive paradigm shift. But to do that accurately, you really need to understand the core motivation, right? Which brings us to the psychological driver of all this. The data points out this all relies on something called a sacred value.
Yeah, sacred value is a technical term from cognitive anthropology. It basically defines a value that a group has that absolutely cannot be traded for anything else. It's totally non-negotiable.
But I want to push back on that a little bit, because people say things are sacred all the time, right? Like an atheist might say human rights are a sacred value. How does the model differentiate between a strong preference and a true sacred value?
It differentiates them by how they react to economic pressure.
Yeah.
In the secular marketplace, the governing philosophy is utilitarianism. The assumption is, well, everybody has their price.
Right, like trading a physical item for enough money.
Exactly. Even deeply held secular values usually have a breaking point if the survival pressure is high enough. It's a transactional universe based on cost-benefit analysis. But a true sacred value breaks that math.
So if the secular marketplace is entirely transactional, does the introduction of God or the divine act as a sort of bug in the economic software of humanity, a point where the math just stops working?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, yeah, that is exactly how a purely secular economist views it, as an irrational anomaly. Because when a sacred value is introduced, standard economic game theory completely falls apart.
Because you can't just offer someone $10 million to renounce their belief in God.
Exactly. To code a sacred value, programmers have to give that variable a weight of absolute infinity. A secular economist looks at a religious devotee refusing a massive payout for a piece of land and says, the math doesn't make sense, you're taking a net loss.
But to the devotee, trading it for any amount of money is an infinite loss.
Precisely. And understanding this non-negotiable mindset is crucial, whether you are deeply religious or a staunch atheist. It fundamentally alters human decision-making and breaks standard economic models.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because once we establish that sacred values can't be bought or compromised, what happens when two different groups hold conflicting sacred values over the exact same thing?
Then you get religious conflict.
Yep.
It arises exactly when those sacred values overlap or clash.
And the primary example the sources provide is Jerusalem, right, which is
Right.
one of the most sacred sites for three different world religions. So we are essentially using algorithms to play out thousands of scenarios in Jerusalem to see which social policies prevent a war.
Yes. The computer models use these clashing sacred values as instigators to simulate the social dynamics of in-groups and out-groups. The goal is to determine the exact dynamics that produce intractable, meaning unsolvable religious conflict versus solvable conflict.
But does the computer actually spit out a peace treaty?
Huh? No, it doesn't print out a treaty, but it has profound social policy implications. By treating religious violence not just as irrational anger, but as a predictable clash of incompatible sacred values, policymakers can use these models to anticipate when violence will erupt.
Wow, so it bridges the gap between studying history and actively protecting the future. They can figure out exactly how to de-escalate it.
Exactly. It shows that de-escalating a religious conflict requires a completely different toolkit than, say, a secular resource war.
Okay, but religious conflict isn't just about sacred sites. The sources also talk about how human societies structure themselves to survive. We shift from explosive violence to, well, the everyday, systemic violence of inequality.
Right, and they trace this back to the earliest religious models. They call it the Shamanism model. It shows that every culture has to figure out how to apportion resources, status, and prestige.
Because someone has to be in charge of deciding who gets the surplus grain if a flood ruins half the crop.
Exactly. And because of that need for an executive decision maker, every single culture inevitably has certain levels of inequality built into it.
So what does this all mean for you? It's kind of wild to think that the exact same hierarchical models used to study ancient shamans and religious power structures perfectly describe the modern corporate ladder or a giant secular government.
This raises an important question. Whether a society is organized around a deity or a secular constitution, it must solve the math problem of resource distribution.
Take a large republic like the US with 300 million people. You need an executive to make quick decisions because asking everyone's opinion is just unfeasible.
Right. But this necessary hierarchy creates compounding negative effects for the people at the bottom. Inequality is a mathematical certainty in large hierarchies.
So the models aim to feed insights back into social policy, to help structure societies, companies, communities, or even churches for the long term.
Exactly. How we choose to mitigate that suffering at the bottom dictates our overall quality of life. The models help us see the tipping points where a society might fracture.
Well, we've covered some incredible ground today. We went from translating ancient Akkadian texts for computer scientists to the clash between secular economics and sacred values, and finally using these digital models to understand everything from religious violence in Jerusalem to inequality in our own workplaces.
It really is a fascinating intersection of disciplines.
It absolutely is, and it leaves us with something really profound to think about. If
Mhm.
computer models can now accurately map out the tipping points of our most sacred, non-negotiable beliefs, what happens when these algorithms get so good that they don't just predict our sacred values, but learn how to manipulate them? Are we looking at a future where peace is mathematically guaranteed, or one where our deepest beliefs are just another programmable input? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll catch you next time.